You're listening to the Bible Uncut and Unfiltered. We believe the Bible doesn't need to be watered down or cleaned up to be understood. Our goal is to provide a healing place to discuss the questions you can't ask and the context you won't learn in church. I'm your host, Colin Connor. Now, on to the episode. As I sit here recording this, I have in front of me a list of the 500 greatest movies of all time on the popular movie ranking site Letterboxd. And it contains exactly what it says, the top 500 ranked movies. Everything from The Godfather to Schindler's List, the first couple of Star Wars movies, that's episodes 4 and 5, to clarify, Lord of the Rings, Citizen Kane, Dark Knight, Lawrence of Arabia, and so much more. Obviously about 495 more. And I am just blown away by the thought of the effort it would take to compile this list, and to be able to even think through what the greatest movies would be. Many of the movies on this list I have seen and enjoy, and then there are many more that I have not seen or even heard of. And just the thought of being able to make it through just this list of movies is mind-boggling. I mean, imagine being given the task of having to find the greatest movie of all time. How could you even know that you had found it? You would have to watch pretty much every movie ever, because even if you leave one unwatched, you have the potential that that could be the greatest movie ever. The content that is out there today, just at the time of this recording, is exponentially growing every single year. Now, I'm a guy who loves movies, but it would not take long before I think I would get tired of watching these movies, trying to find the best one, even in this list of 500. I would imagine I would need a break after a while. But let's expand this thought experiment beyond movies for a second, and imagine that you were given the task of finding the best of anything in any given category. It could be the best restaurant in your town. It could be the best book ever written. It could be the best pair of shoes, whatever it may be. Think about all that would go into that. And now you are given unlimited time and unlimited money to find it. How would you start? What would the process look like? And how long before you feel like you could make an informed decision? How long before you get tired of the process as a whole? This thought experiment, as crazy as it may sound to us, is essentially the idea of the biblical book of Ecclesiastes. The main character, who goes by the title Qoheleth, is presented as a Solomon-like person, someone with all of the power, money, and prestige that the world has to offer. And he goes on a quest to find not just the best restaurant in Jerusalem or the funniest court comedian. No, he is trying to find the best way to live life. Think about those self-help books you'll find that aggressively tell you this is exactly the schedule that you need to live your life by, and they time box out your life in like 5-minute increments of exactly what you have to do from 4 a.m. to 2 a.m. That's essentially what Qoheleth is doing. He is saying, I want to find the best way to live. I want to find the good life. And this book of Ecclesiastes invites us on the quest with him. So without any further ado, let's join Qoheleth on his adventure and see what we can learn from the first chapter of Ecclesiastes, Uncut and Unfiltered. Ecclesiastes begins, the words of Qoheleth, the son of David, king in Jerusalem. Hevel of Hevels, says Qoheleth, Hevel of Hevels, everything is Hevel. If you have not yet, I highly recommend you go back and listen to last week's episode that we had called Ecclesiastes, the stuff you don't know. We like to start every series with one of those because, well, there's a lot in life that we don't know, and some of the things we know we don't know, and then there are some things that we don't know we don't know. And it's those things that we don't realize we are unaware of that can really affect the way we understand and approach the Bible. So we spent some time in our study last week talking about key words and key themes and the setting of the book. So I highly recommend going back and checking that out if you have not already. Last week, we mentioned that this word, often translated preacher or teacher in many English Bibles, is the Hebrew word Qoheleth, and it does not mean preacher or teacher. What exactly it means is a matter of debate, but the general meaning is somebody who assembles together a group of people. He is a public speaker, if you will. I kind of imagine him being like Terrence from Yes Man, except just the opposite. So instead of going around telling people to say yes to everything, he would go around telling you to say no to everything. He is like the anti-yes man. He is a demotivational speaker, if you will. He wants you to question everything in life. In Eugene Peterson's Bible translation called The Message, he gave him the title of the Quester, and I love that. He's the only person I've seen who does that. It makes me feel like he's the DM in Dungeons and Dragons, but hey, I like it. So that's a fun option. And I know the Message Bible gets a lot of hate in some Christian circles, but the more that I read from it, the more I think that Eugene Peterson actually really understood the underlying languages and got the nuance right in a lot of places. It is a dynamic translation, so it's not going to be word for word. It's not going to sound like a lot of other Bible versions. But in a book like this, like Ecclesiastes, where the concepts are so complex, I think a dynamic translation like The Message can be extremely useful. So I would actually highly recommend checking out The Message and a couple other dynamic translations of Ecclesiastes. They were some of my favorite ways to read through this book. Going back to verse 1, I want to point out that the word in Hebrew is davar. And davar can mean word, but it's a little more general than that as well. It can mean matter or like a concept. A lot of dictionaries will say thing because it doesn't really mean thing, but it's just kind of a very general word that can apply to a lot of concepts. So it's possible that this could be saying the words of Qoheleth. It could also be saying this is like the deeds of Qoheleth, the matter of Qoheleth, the story of Qoheleth. And this is going to show up as kind of a recurring possibility throughout the book because there's a lot of times he references matters or words being hevel, that word that we talked about last week that is often translated vanity. It does not mean vanity. It has more the idea of something that is impermanent or enigmatic. But this is going to be something that comes up a few times in the book where he could possibly be talking about words or he could just be talking about things in general. And I'll try to point that out as it comes up because it changes the meaning of these verses a little bit, but at the end of the day, I think we can just get the idea that he is trying to talk about all things that happen. His quest to hack life is a very comprehensive one. Now, there is a little bit of debate that goes on here in verse 1 about whether king in Jerusalem modifies David or whether it modifies Qoheleth. Either way, not much changes since we all know that David was king in Jerusalem, and Qoheleth seems to be adopting this Solomonic persona, even if he himself was not Solomon. If you are not familiar with what I'm talking about there, go back to last week's episode. We talk about the identity of Qoheleth and why he likely was not Solomon, even though that's what a lot of Christians believe. Now, as we move into verse 2, there's some debate over exactly whether or not this begins Qoheleth's monologue. Like, pretty much everyone would say that verse 1 at least is an introduction, but some people think that his speech begins here in verse 2. Others think it's ahead in verse 4. Some others put it all the way out in verse 12. Personally, I lean toward thinking that verse 4 is the beginning of Qoheleth's speech, and verses 1 through 3 are introduction. Last week we noted that the book begins and ends with the voice of someone who is not Qoheleth. He is often given the title the frame narrator. He's like the dean at a college that introduces a guest speaker and then gets up again at the end to give some closing remarks. So I think that the first 3 verses are probably his saying, here's who you're about to hear from, and here's what he's about to talk about. And then in verses 4, pretty much on through like the start of chapter 12, you just have Qoheleth's monologue. Wherever you put the start of it, whether it's at verse 2 or 12 or where, it doesn't make a huge difference. Just for me, it makes sense to have the brief introduction of those first 3 verses. And then to me, verses 4 through 11 kind of feel like they're dealing with their own topic. So I think it's probably the start of his speech. Last week, we took some time to talk about what that word hevel means. again, it's often translated vanity. That would not be a great translation for it. I know I already brought this up, but I want to mention it again because when people think of Ecclesiastes, if they're familiar with the book, they tend to think of this word vanity, and it is just so far removed from what that word actually would have meant in Hebrew that I don't think it's a helpful term at all. So we need to throw that out, and I just try to say the word hevel there in order to remind you this is not vanity, this is impermanent and or enigmatic. So I would actually encourage you after every episode, go ahead and check out the chapter that we deal with. We're going to go through one chapter every week, and whenever you see that word vanity, read in the word impermanent and see how it changes the meaning of the verse. And then go back, read the chapter a second time, and replace vanity with enigmatic, hard to understand, confusing, frustrating, something like that, and see how that changes the meaning. Because sometimes it could be more leaning toward impermanent, other times it could be leaning more toward enigmatic, and the context really kind of decides that. But it's a fun exercise that helps you to understand the book better. That word hevel does not show up too many other times in the rest of the Hebrew scriptures. In fact, it shows up more times here in Ecclesiastes than it does in the rest of the Tanakh combined. However, there is a very interesting use, and the Net Bible Notes pointed this out. I hadn't seen anyone else address this. Isaiah 49:4 takes this word and puts it on parallel with the Hebrew word tohu. The verse reads, "Then I said, I have labored in vain. I have spent my strength for naught, and in vain. Yet surely my judgment is with Yahweh, and my work with God." So this is right in the middle of the verse. You have letohu v'hevel. Now, if you listen to our first couple episodes on Genesis, you might recognize that word tohu. It's from the very beginning of the Bible where it says that the earth was, and many translations will say formless and void, but it's tohu vavohu, wild and waste, as some have now taken to translating it, and I prefer that. So Isaiah 49:4 takes the first of those, the wild word, and adds it to hevel. So it's like Isaiah 49:4 is drawing on both Genesis 1 creation language and Ecclesiastes 1 language to talk about chaos in a way, because that's the topics of both Genesis 1 and Ecclesiastes 1. And that's part of why I want to do this Ecclesiastes series now, shortly after we've done those Genesis series, is because Genesis 1 begins with chaos and then presents how God brings order out of that. And Ecclesiastes is really a book about recognizing the chaos in life for what it is, and that even though God has brought order into this world, there's still a lot that doesn't work the way that it should. And how can we find order in the midst of all of that chaos? So I think it's going to be a really helpful study that actually builds on everything we've talked about from the first 11 chapters of Genesis. When Qoheleth says, hevel of hevel, everything is hevel, it's hevel havalim. And that's his way of saying this is the most enigmatic thing ever. So hevel of hevel is like when you have holy of holies in scripture, or king of kings, or lord of lords, or something like that. The idea is saying this is the greatest of all time. I think the closest thing we might have in modern English is like a man's man, like saying this is the manliest type of man you could have, something like that. This is the idea. He's talking about the most enigmatic thing that you can possibly imagine. So it's like he just gets up to speak, putting it back in this college setting as if he's in front of a university and he's speaking to all of these students. He's introduced, he gets up, and the very first thing he says is confusion. The most confusing thing. And then he repeats himself. The most confusing thing. What is it? Everything. Everything is confusing. Everything is enigmatic. I have a really hard time not reading verse 2 in like a college stoner voice. He's just kind of got that stereotypical early 2000s stoner vibe going on right now. It's like, it's all so confusing, dude. Like, it's all so confusing, man. Like, all of it. I picture him smoking something during this entire speech, which would actually be a really good illustration given that he talks about this hevel, which really means smoke or something impermanent. One of my favorite resources in everything that I studied for this series was a book called Ecclesiastes Annotated and Explained, and it was written by Ravi Rami Shapiro. It was basically a dynamic translation of the book that he had written, along with some comments that he had, both of which were very good. But I also really liked how he would draw on other texts from outside of the Bible in order to help shed some light on the passage that he's talking about. And one of the texts that he would often quote from is the Dhammapada, which is a Buddhist collection of scriptures. And there's a lot of sayings in the Dhammapada that sound similar to what Qoheleth is saying in Ecclesiastes. For example, he referenced the Dhammapada 13:4, which says, "Look upon the world as you would upon a bubble. Look upon it like a mirage." And in a lot of ways, I see that similarity in this word hevel. It's like a bubble. And we mentioned last week the word itself means smoke, but it has this idea of something that's impermanent because you can't grasp smoke. It's there, but it floats away and you can see it for a little bit and then it's gone. It just vaporizes, it just dissipates. And a bubble is kind of the same thing. Like, it's beautiful. You can look at it, it's mesmerizing if you see a bunch of bubbles in the air. But it's not long before they pop. And they're just here 1 second and gone the next. And I think that kind of gets at what Qoheleth is trying to say. In another portion of the Dhammapada, there's a saying, "All conditioned things are impermanent. The one who knows and perceives this fact ceases to be miserable. This is the way to purity of vision." Again, that's basically beat for beat the wisdom of what Ecclesiastes and Qoheleth are sharing, because they're saying that we try to find happiness, but really we just end up in this rat race, in this cycle, this hamster wheel of trying to find pleasure, getting what we want, and then wanting something more. And we waste all of this time trying to get on to the next thing, and we miss what we have right in the moment. So really it takes a deconstruction of everything that we're looking to in life in order to actually enjoy life. And it's only once we realize how impermanent life is that we can start to enjoy the little time that we have. Most of us go through our lives trying to avoid these angst-ridden existential crises. We don't like the thought that eventually we are going to die, be that tomorrow or 80 years from now. We don't like the thought of how easily we could lose the things that we enjoy and the people that we love. But in reality, there is so little in life that we control. I know a lot of people who struggle with fear and anxiety over all the things that could go wrong in life. They worry about anything that they can't control, anything that is in the hands of another person. But the reality is, when you stop and think about it, everything is out of our control. There is nothing that is truly 100% safe. You could go outside to get the mail today and be hit by a car. You could be sitting in your home watching TV and have a heart attack. Most people don't want to hear that. In fact, you may even be listening to this and now you're feeling upset that I even brought this up. But what Qoheleth is trying to say is that we can't run from those realities. Because whether it's a car that hits you get in the mail, a heart attack that gets you in your own house, or eventually just old age 60 years from now, something is going to happen. You could have every valuable in your house locked up in a safe, and it could still get stolen. There could still be a flood or fire damage or what have you, any number of things, and we can't control that. Can you feel the anxiety rising in you yet? Qoheleth is not exactly someone you want to have at parties. He is the type of person who will harsh the mellow really fast. And yet he's doing it on purpose, because his whole thesis is that you don't actually enjoy what you have until you are okay with realizing you won't have it forever. It's only once you accept the impermanence of life and possessions and family and friends that you can enjoy what you have in the time that you have it. We waste so much time chasing after things, grasping at them, trying to hold on to things that are actually outside of our control, that Qoheleth is saying, stop. You can't grasp smoke. You can't capture a bubble. You just have to enjoy them while they exist. And the same thing is true of life and everything that we own or enjoy doing. So, as backwards as it sounds, we actually have to lean into that impermanence. We have to face those anxieties and fears if we are ever to overcome them and enjoy what we have. Verse 3 carries on this thought to question, what profit does a person have of all their labor which they undertake under the sun? And that word profit, it's the Hebrew word yitron. It means the remainder. What actually is left over at the end of your life? Now that we are several thousand years into recorded human history, think about the billions upon billions upon billions of people who have existed just in the last several thousand years. How many of them do we know anything about? Comparatively few. Think about all the CEOs in the world today. How many of them are actually known by name by the average person? Not many. How many of them are going to be remembered after the next CEO takes over? Not many. This whole verse is questioning what is going to happen at the end of your life. Is there going to be a positive balance in the books of your life? Now, I'm not saying that everybody needs to be this great person who makes it into the history books, but what do you do with what you have? What is actually going to be left over? What remainder is there? Do you have any net positive to show for this little blip of time that you lived as a human? I think Qoheleth would really approve of the 2015 song How Did You Love by Shinedown. The first verse reads, "You can have the sound of 1,000 voices calling your name. You can have the light of the world blind you, bathe you in grace. But I don't see so easily what you hold in your hands, because castles crumble, kingdoms fall, and turn into sand. You could be an angel of mercy, or given to hate. You can try to fight it just like every other careless mistake. How do you justify? I'm mystified by the ways of your heart. With a million lies, the truth will rise to tear you apart. No one gets out alive. Every day is do or die. The one thing you leave behind is how did you love? How did you love?" Now, we're jumping a little bit ahead in application there, but I like the way that the song gets into how did you love. I think it's actually a very Christian message, even though it's not necessarily a Christian band. But the core idea that they're getting at in that song is, what do you actually leave behind in the end of your life? What are you going to be remembered for, if anything? And interestingly enough, the conclusion that Shinedown reaches is very similar to the one that Qoheleth will eventually reach, and we won't see that until next week. But the idea is, it doesn't really matter how much of an impact you make on the world, how much money you make, how far up the corporate ladder you go, how many books you write or read, what kind of car you drive. Any of those things, ultimately it comes down to, how did you love? How did you deal with the relationships that you had? Those are the things that matter the most. I want to point out as well that labor here in this verse is not just talking about the stuff you get paid for. That's not just your 9 to 5 job. It's anything that you work at. So this could even be talking about upkeep around the house, or hobbies that you have, or anything like that. Rabbi Shapiro said, Qoheleth is simply saying that the value of action is in the action itself, not the result, because the result can't be predetermined, and it's always temporary anyway. For example, what profit, in the sense of something left over, is there in burning a candle in the dark? Well, none, if we expect that something of value remains when the candle burns down and the flame sputters out. But that doesn't mean that there was no value while the candle was aflame. While nothing has permanent profit, many things can profit us in the moment. End quote. I love that illustration he gives of the candle burning, because at the end of the day, you could look at a burnt out candle and say, what a waste. But what about all the time that it lit up the room? If you're only focused on the result, you're going to miss the beauty of the process. Now, the verse here ends by talking about under the sun. And this is something we got into a little bit last week. A common Christian reading of this phrase is to suggest that Qoheleth was doing a thought experiment where he removed God from the picture. And that's why the book is then so negative, at least from their point of view. We're going to discuss as we go on whether or not the book is actually as nihilistic as many think. But then the preachers jump in and say, well, the reason that he's so pessimistic about life is because he's just looking at life under the sun. He's removed God from the picture. That's your problem. You take God out of the picture, and life is just miserable, like Ecclesiastes. That's just simply not true. Last week we mentioned a quote from the Epic of Gilgamesh that says, only the gods live forever under the sun. So it really helped us to understand that from an ancient context, under the sun does not mean everything that happens in the human realm and beyond the sun is God's realm. No, under the sun is just a way of saying everything that could possibly be. It is a comprehensive term, and from the ancient mindset, even the gods themselves lived under the sun. Christopher Wright, in hearing the message of Ecclesiastes, said, God is active under the sun, and that's the problem. It's meant to be a comprehensive term, not a limiting one. Now, I think it's important that as we read this book, we remember that Qoheleth is not an atheist. He is a theist, and that's what causes the whole problem. He acknowledges that there is a God and that the God is working in the world. But whatever this God is doing is not solving the problem of evil. And in fact, sometimes it seems like the bad people in the world get rewarded and the good people get punished. So the problem isn't that there is no God. The problem is that there is a God and things aren't working out the way that they probably should if there is a God. In many ways, Ecclesiastes is similar to the biblical book of Job, where Job questions God. Quite literally, there are several chapters of Job going back and forth with his wannabe theology bros who are trying to figure out why so many bad things happen to an arguably good person. And Job eventually questions God himself, and God shows up and has this whole debate with Job. That is a very strange and fascinating book that we'll probably have to do a series on at some point, but it's very complex and it's a pretty long book too, so that one's a little further down the road. But like I mentioned last week, Bible Project has done some really good work showing how Job, Proverbs, and Ecclesiastes are all kind of in conversation with each other. In fact, Douglas Fife, in Seeing What Qoheleth Saw, says that he has seen echoes of Job 28 in this verse, and perhaps even a nihilistic retelling of Psalm 8. Now, I've looked at those passages, and I don't quite see the same connection that Fife does. Maybe a little bit more in the Job 28 passage, but feel free to check those out and let me know if you see kind of an inversion of Psalm 8 here in these first few verses of chapter 1. For any of our word nerds out there, there's a really strange occurrence here in chapter 1, verse 3, of just the Hebrew letter shin. Now, there is a relative pronoun there, essentially which in English, and it's asher in Hebrew. But here it's not asher, it's just sh. It's just literally the letter shin. What's so interesting about that is it seems like there was kind of a divide after the Northern and Southern Kingdom split, where the Southern Kingdom used the full word asher, and the Northern Kingdom started to just contract it into just the letter shin. So there are some scholars who look at this and think that perhaps this book of Ecclesiastes was written later on in Hebrew history and in the Northern rather than the Southern Kingdom, based on this strange usage of the relative pronoun. In verse 4, Qoheleth observes, one generation passes away and another generation comes, but the earth endures forever. We've got a few interesting concepts to talk about here. The first is that word generation. The New International Commentary on the Old Testament, often abbreviated Uncut, said that in 1968, Graham Ogden published a short article arguing that this word door, the word translated generation, did not relate to human generations as here in Ecclesiastes, but rather to the cycles of nature. He sees a contrast between a cyclic movement within nature, which contrasts with the Earth's permanence. End of quote. So essentially, some people look at this and they think that the Hebrew word dor means a generation of people. Other people look at it and they think it means a cycle of time. Honestly, I think either could work. The context starts to get into these nature cycles, so I think it could fit that better. But it also makes sense to me if you're talking about people here. And maybe there's a little bit of a double entendre intended where it could refer to both. Talking about one generation passing away, quite literally, it's the word for walking. One generation walks away and another generation approaches. And I think it's interesting that he emphasizes the one passing away first. Now, if we take the idea that this is human generations, normally we would say people come on the scene, people leave the scene. But here he says people leave the scene, people come on the scene. So he emphasizes death first. He doesn't say that someone comes and goes, he says they go and come. It's yet another reminder that we are going to die and someone is going to replace us. It takes the focus off of us because usually we think of, oh, eventually our parents' generation is going to pass from the scene and we're going to pick up the reins and take over. But what Qoheleth is saying is, well, how long until you're the one who's passing off the scene and the next generation is taking over? So it kind of stops us from being the hero of the story and makes us focus on our own impermanence. We should also take a second and talk about eternity here, because the verse ends in a lot of English translations as saying that the earth remains forever, or something similar to that. And this can confuse a lot of Christians because many Christians believe that God is going to destroy this world and then eventually create another one. So they say, well, the earth definitely does not remain forever, so what exactly does this mean? Now, that whole idea of God destroying the world and creating a new one is a totally other topic. It is actually debated exactly how and if that even works. That is another topic for another day that I have addressed a couple times in passing in the podcast before. Very long story short, that's not necessarily what the Bible teaches, depending on how you translate a couple of very hard to translate passages. But regardless, that's not really what's going on here in this verse, because the ancient Hebrews didn't necessarily have the concept of eternity or forever that we do today. Whenever you see eternity or forever or something along those lines in your English translation of the Old Testament, it's going to actually be the Hebrew word olam. And olam does not actually mean eternity or forever. It just means an age, a long time, some duration of something. And in order to grasp that meaning, we have to learn what the ancient Hebrews thought of when it came to time. They saw two different ages, two different time periods of history. There is the age that is, and there is the age that will be, or the age to come. In other words, there is the time in which we live right now where things are post-Eden, messed up, but we're making the most of it. And then there is the age to come when God is going to set everything right, get us back to an Eden-like state where we are in union with each other and with Him. So they didn't necessarily have like a past, present, future idea as much as current time when things are iffy and future time when things are going to be set right. So that's what we have here, is quite literally this verse is reading, but the earth stands to the age. So in other words, it's saying that as long as this age remains, before we hit the next age, this earth will remain, even though we don't. And again, getting into whether or not the earth will remain into the next age is another conversation. But we have to realize, too, that he is speaking in very broad generalities here. So it's okay to see some hyperbole in what he's saying. Interestingly enough, there is a very similar statement made in an Egyptian text that predates Ecclesiastes. It's called the Egyptian Harper's Song, and it reads, "One generation passes, another stays behind." Now, notice the way that it started with a generation passing, and then the other one coming on behind it, just like Ecclesiastes. So one generation passes, another stays behind. Such has it been since the men of ancient times. There is no return for them to explain their present state of being, to say how it is with them, to gentle our hearts until we hasten to the place where they have gone. So spend your days joyfully, and don't be weary with living. No man takes his things with him, and none can go back again. End of quote. When I first came across this in doing the study, I could not believe how similar that was to the message of Ecclesiastes. I really think that whoever wrote this book had to have known about this Egyptian harper song and was riffing on it because the concept and even the phrasing is so similar. I mean, even down to his saying that there is no way for the dead to return and tell us what the afterlife is like, if there even is one. That's something that Ecclesiastes is going to touch on as well. And then the conclusion to not get frustrated with life, but just to enjoy it because we can't take anything with us. That's also very similar to Ecclesiastes. I really like how Bible Project illustrates this concept. They talk about all the crazy things that you can do in life, but then if you go and climb a mountain and just stand on top of it for a while, you realize how long it has been there before you, how long it will be there after you, and how little it cares about what you have done. I mean, just think about some natural landmark in your area. I live not too far from the Delaware River that separates New Jersey and Pennsylvania. Think about how many clothing styles the Delaware River has seen come and go over the years. Think about how many music styles. Think about how many people have crossed over it. Think about how many people have lived near it and felt like their life was crumbling or their world was falling apart or they were having some huge crisis. And how much does the Delaware River care about that? Not at all. It just keeps flowing. It just keeps doing its job. It did that long before I lived, and it's going to keep doing it long after I'm gone. And while some people may find that concept discouraging, I think there's actually some freedom in it. And I think Qoheleth was believing that as well. Because we're all the heroes of our own stories. We think that the world revolves around us, whether we admit it or not. That's why sometimes when you just get so overwhelmed with something, you feel like life is stopping and the world is going crazy and it's about to explode. But if you actually pause for a second, no matter how horrible whatever is happening actually is, you realize that the people around you don't know and don't care. I don't mean that in a mean way, like, they don't care about you. It's just they don't know to care about you because they don't know you. Think about the most horrible day that you've ever had in your life and realize that there were people living, driving, walking, just within a couple 100 feet of you, more than likely, that had no clue what was going on. Maybe they were having a horrible day. Maybe they were having the best day of their life. Maybe they were just having an okay day. But the majority of people on the road at that time or on your street or wherever you happened to be while you were having such a horrible day, the majority of people weren't affected by that. Now, it seems like the biggest thing in the world to you, but to the majority of humans, 99.99999% of them that were alive at that time, it means nothing. And the same is true of how you feel about their struggles. And then if we take it to include the people who lived before and the people who are going to live after us, it's an even more infinitesimal percentage of people that our life affects. And there is actually some freedom when you stop and realize that you're not as big of a deal as you think you are. It truly does not matter how many people you have in your circle of influence. It is still significantly less than the majority of the world alive right now, let alone the majority of people who have ever lived. And that's not to say that the things that happen to you or me are unimportant. The fact that they happen to us does make them important. They're just not necessarily as world-ending as we tend to think of them as being. I grew up reading the Peanuts comic strips that Charles Schulz wrote, and one of my favorite characters was Linus. And for a while, he was known for this bit where he would come into some other conversation that some of the other kids were talking about something, and he would just say, 500 years from now, who'll know the difference? And that's basically what Qoheleth is saying too. 500 years from now, who will know the difference? And the answer is next to no one. Verse 5 says, the sun rises and the sun goes down, and it runs to its place where it arose. The wind goes toward the south. It turns about to the north. It whirls about continually, and the wind returns again to its circuits. All the rivers run into the sea, yet the sea is not full. To the place from where the rivers came, there they return again. This word in verse 5, where the sun hastens or runs to its place where it came from, it's literally the word for panting. And there are some positive or negative connotations for that word in the Old Testament. Sometimes it can be positive, like Psalm 119, 131, talking about panting after God's Torah. Or there can be times it can be negative, like having this panting with exhaustion, Nycott says, like a woman in childbirth in Isaiah 42:14. Nycott continues, depending on which nuance is adopted in Ecclesiastes, either the sun joyously rushes back to its starting point so it can once again begin its glorious march across the sky, or the sun toils across the sky only to reach its destination, achieve no rest, no closure, and need to rush back to do the whole meaningless task over again. Context and the overall message of the book will determine one's understanding, and the author of Nycott says, in my opinion, the negative meaning is supported and was so understood by the Septuagint, which translated it drags, the sun drags itself, or the Targum readings of crawls. End quote. And I agree with the author of Nycott. I don't think that Qoheleth is speaking of a very cheerful sun that is just happy to keep doing its little job every single day and woohoo, I get to do the same thing today. I think he's trying to emphasize this monotony of the same thing happening over and over and over again. In the Brazos theological commentary on Ecclesiastes, they start off the Ecclesiastes section with a quote from G.K. Chesterton's Orthodoxy, and he takes the more positive view of this sun panting. It's an interesting quote. He says, the sun rises every morning. I don't rise every morning. You gotta love Chesterton's humor there. I don't rise every morning, but the variation is due not to my activity, but to my inaction. Now, to put the matter in a popular phrase, it might be true that the sun rises regularly because he never gets tired of rising. His routine might be due not to a lifelessness, but to a rush of life. The thing I mean can be seen, for instance, in children. When they find some game or joke that they specially enjoy, a child kicks his legs rhythmically through excess, not absence of life. Because children have abounding vitality, because they are in spirit fierce and free, therefore they want things repeated and unchanged. And any parents of young children here say amen. They always say, do it again. And the grown-up person does it again until he is nearly dead. And yes, that is actually what Chesterton says. For grown-up people are not strong enough to exult in monotony. But perhaps God is strong enough to exult in monotony. It is possible that God says every morning, do it again, to the sun, and every evening, do it again, to the moon. For any hockey fans listening right now, I just have that scene from Miracle of the coach with the whistle making the players run suicides back and forth on the ice. Again, Craig. Chesterton continues, it may not be automatic necessity that makes all daisies alike. It may be that God makes every daisy separately, but has never gotten tired of making them. It may be that he has eternal appetite of infancy, for we have sinned and grown old, and our Father is younger than we. End of quote. It's a really charming picture that Chesterton has. I have to admit, I am amused by it. But I do lean more toward Nycott's view, that this is about a monotonous, Sisyphean-like grind that the rivers and the sun are caught up in, and even we ourselves are caught up in. Rabbi Shapiro furthers this thought as well. He says, what would happen if the sun rose and set but once? Or if the wind blew in one direction only? Or if the sea actually filled up? Life as we know it would end. Nature requires Hevel. What is true of nature is true of you as well. You are not on a journey from point A to point B. The goal isn't to arrive. Rather, it is to meander, to saunter, to make your life a holy wandering. End of quote. That's a beautiful way to encapsulate the message that Qoheleth has right here. For the beauty of nature to exist, Hevel has to exist. There has to be a continual emptying, continual cycles, and we are the same. Now, I want to point out as well that these verses are not necessarily talking about the modern scientific way that we understand wind patterns or evaporation cycles of water. That's not what would have been in the ancient mindset. And I know, at least in the way I grew up, there would be like creation science type textbooks that would try to say, oh, see, thousands of years ago, God knew that this is the way that the world actually worked, and there were these wind cycles and the water evaporation cycles and all this. And see, it is hidden right here in the Bible. I don't think that's the way this is intended to be read. Now, would God have known that? Sure. Would the authors? Probably not. And there's no reason to think that God would have hidden that within the Bible and had it mean nothing to people for a couple thousand years until our modern scientific understandings came to prominence. See, it's less about scientific understandings of water or wind, and it's more about just the cyclical nature of life and, well, nature. See, we tend to think in a more linear fashion right now, but many ancient cultures, and even some people in Eastern cultures still today, tend to think in more cyclical terms. In his short work, The Philosophy of Qoheleth, Joel Steele writes, the notion of causation, the operation of impersonal laws governing events, were absent in the ancients' view. They made no real attempt to understand events, mainly because it was irrelevant to them. Often, they would credit the gods for various underlying factors that occurred in their animated world. Moreover, there was no concept of humanity's progress. Thus, time for the ancients would go around in this vast historical cycle of meaning. There was a cycle of regularities, daily, monthly, yearly events that would all return to the point where they began. Flood, drought, famine were inevitably repetitive. They concluded that if nature went in cycles, so did humanity. End of quote. Now, in verse 7, there's an oddity of Hebrew grammar that does not translate over well into English, and it's that there's actually another to go in there. Most English translations will read something along the lines of, all the rivers run to the sea is not full, to the place from where the rivers come, there they return again. But in Hebrew, you have to go after that. So it would read, from where the rivers come, there they return again, to go. Now, that's been removed because, well, that doesn't sound right in English, but Robert Alter, in his translation and commentary, noted that it's part of the essential stylistic pattern of verbal repetition that mirrors this concept of repetition in nature itself. End of quote. So there's kind of a purposeful repetitiveness that we lose when we try to smooth that out in English. Verse 8 reads, all things are full of labor. Man can't utter it. The eye is not satisfied with seeing, nor the ear filled with hearing. Now, here's an example, again, of where we have this word things, and it's that word davar. So this could be Qoheleth saying all things, all matter, everything that we're dealing with is troublesome. Or it could be the word word, in which case he would be saying all words, all sayings, all books, all knowledge, something like that, is exhausting. That would be a little more meta of an observation since he himself is making commentary by words, but I think it is also still a possibility. I think this could go either way. And that word that is translated labor, at least in some of the older versions, it literally means exhausting. This verse could literally be read, everything is exhausting. A human can't even comprehend to speak it. You could perhaps even say, we can't exhaust talking about life. Like, we can't even speak to the presence of it. The New Century Version says, everything is boring. So boring that you don't even want to talk about it. That kind of reminds me of sitcoms and just the modern idea of a sitcom where you have oftentimes boring everyday situations that we try to add humor into, but eventually you watch enough of them and they all just start to blur together, and it almost gets depressing watching these people talk through the same crap that I have to deal with in life. So it's kind of just talking about this way that life can be exhausting. Rabbi Shapiro said, seeing and hearing are acts of continual emptying, of hevel. You can't see this until you stop seeing that. You can't hear new sounds if your ears are continually ringing with old sounds. Qoheleth is telling you that clinging is dying, and emptying is living. For life is ceaseless change. Seeing and hearing are all about change, while exhausting talk is about clinging to the words of the past, no matter how out of sync with truth they may be. End of quote. I gotta say, wow, that blew me away. I have never thought about it quite in that light, but I think there's a lot of wisdom there. When I was in college, there was an older guy. He used to be a professor there at the college, and by the time I got there, he was basically the campus chaplain in a way. He had retired, but he still hung around. And one of the things that he was famous for, there were many, but he would talk about having open hands before God. And he would often get up in front of the students and have these clenched fists up to the sky. And he would say that this is how we tend to live our lives. We are trying to hold on desperately to things that are slipping through our fingers. And he would say that the only way you can actually enjoy life is if you have open hands before God. Because what we're trying to hold on to for fear of it being taken away is maybe not the best thing for us. Maybe God wants to actually give us something better than what we already have. But you can't receive in clenched fists. You can only receive with open hands. Now, yes, you can also lose what you have in your hands if your hands are open. But if life is hevel, smoke, vapor, mist, it just falls through your fingers like sand anyway. So you're not really holding on to anything when you try to grasp it like that. So if you keep your hands open, you're acknowledging that you have no power over your own life anyway. And yet now you are also in a position in which you can accept more good out of life. I think Qoheleth would nod in approval. Now, verse 9 starts a new section of his thought process. He says, "That which has been is actually that which will be, and that which is done is that which will be done. There is nothing new under the sun. Is there anything of which it can be said, 'See, this is new'? Well, it's already been there before, which was the time before us. There's no remembrance of former things, neither will there be any remembrance of the things to come with those that will come after us." Peterson in the Message Bible translated it, "There's nothing new on this earth. Year after year, it's the same old thing." Does someone call out, "Hey, this is new"? Don't get excited. It's the same old story. Nobody remembers what happened yesterday. And the things that'll happen tomorrow? No one will remember them either. Don't count on being remembered. You see why I like his translation of this? It just really brings it down to earth. Let's talk about this idea of nothing new under the sun, because this gets some different opinions depending on who you read as a commentator. Some people look at this and they think that Qoheleth is saying that everything can be boiled down to a few key needs, wants, desires that have just been done time and time again. Because, there are new things. There's a new iPhone that comes out every so often. There's new movies that come out every month. New cars, new technology, fill in the blank. There are new things. But ultimately, they can all be boiled down to some core concept that's been around forever. Sure, there's a new iPhone, but really, we're just trying to find ways to stay more connected as humans. And humans have been talking to each other for as long as there have been humans. Sure, a spaceship can be new, but humans have been traveling and trying to push the limits of how far we can go from the very first time that someone walked outside of their village. So some people will read this as saying that there is ultimately nothing new, no matter how novel it can seem, you can boil it down to some core thing that has been around forever. There's another way that you can look at this, though, and it's kind of fascinating to me. We have to remember that just because something is in the Bible does not automatically mean that we have to agree with it. This is the problem with people who say things along the lines of, "The Bible says it, I believe it, that settles it." They think that they're treating the Bible as this guidebook for life, but the Bible was not written to be a guidebook for life. It is not an encyclopedia where you just open it up, find the topic that you're concerned about, and get an answer for how to answer your problem. No, the Bible is a story. It's a narrative. And sometimes you have people in a story do or say things that the author doesn't necessarily agree with. He just needs it there in the story for conflict or to prove a point or character development or what have you. If you say the Bible says it, I believe it, that settles it. Well, I can find things that Satan said in the Bible and go, well, see, the Bible says it, I believe it, that settles it. The Bible isn't meant to be read that way. We have to be more honest with the text and treat it with more respect, that we actually try to learn what it means in the context. So just because Qoheleth says something does not automatically mean that is the end goal. That is what we are supposed to take from this. Now, it could be, or maybe he's a foil for this. We have to kind of consider what is actually true in this situation. So some people have looked at this and thought that Qoheleth was, as C.S. Lewis would put it, a chronological snob. In other words, he thought that he was living at the peak of human history, that everything that could happen in human history had happened by this point. There is nothing better that humanity could achieve than what he saw around him in his day. Now, that sounds a little ridiculous to us a couple thousand years later and everything that we have, but by the same token, don't we do the same thing? Don't we look back on people in Bible times and think, my, how simple they were, how stupid they were, they didn't understand this, how could you live without XYZ technology? Well, they did, and the majority of humans have lived without our technologies for thousands of years. Now, I am very thankful that I am living in the time that I am living in. There is no way that I could survive without air conditioning. Like, of all of the modern conveniences and technologies and information that we have today, if I could not give up one thing, I think it would be air conditioning, because I do not do well once it gets above a certain temperature. But just because I like this time period in history does not mean that this is the best time period in history. It could get better in the future, or really there could be times in the past that it has been better. And really, I think that just comes down to the person and what you make of the time that you live in. So it's possible that Qoheleth is sitting here going, we've reached the peak of humanity. And in a lot of ways, we repeat that same hubris. So I kind of wonder if Qoheleth was a chronological snob here, and if he was just saying, man, we have reached the peak, we can't get any better than this. And that's something that sometimes we tend to do as well. So perhaps by adding this claim, the author is encouraging us to question that concept and to think about the ways that quality of life is kind of subjective to how you live, regardless of what time period you live in. Now, different translations will translate verse 10 a little bit differently. Some have it as a statement, others have it as a question, and that's just a matter of translation. It seems like it should probably be a question, but either way, it doesn't really change the meaning. So you have some translations that have the question, is there anything of which you can say, see, this is new? You have this in like the King James, ASV, RSV, NASB, NIV, but then you have others that take it as a statement saying, there is something of which you can say, see, this is new. I'm looking at the Net Bible's notes on this, and they say the NAB, NJPS, and Moffat's translation go along this route. So basically what they're saying at that point is, you can say, hey, this is something new, but then at the end of the day you realize, actually, it's not as new as we thought it was. So either way, the point is, whether you think something's new or you're just questioning if there is anything new in life, really nothing actually is. And again, you can take that as either talking about the core concepts, or you can think maybe he was thinking he had reached the pinnacle of human existence and tried everything that there was ever to try. And in that case, maybe he was just speaking hyperbolically. Verse 11, there's kind of a split down the middle with translations. Because if you have one that has italics, like the old King James, you'll see that the word things is italicized. There is no remembrance of former things. And whenever you have a word in italics, that means it's not there in the original text, but the translators supplied it in order to make the English read more smoothly. So literally it's saying, no remembrance of former. And so you have to ask, well, former what? And some translations, like King James, say former things, just anything that has happened before. But then there are also some other translations that think it's actually talking about former generations. So it could be saying that the great deeds that have been done in the past are forgotten, just like one day the things that we do will be forgotten. Or it could be saying great people of the past are forgotten, just like one day we will be as well. Really, either one works, and I could see either being the intended meaning. If you think about it in terms of people, that makes sense too. Even the most famous person that you could possibly think of, they are going to be forgotten within just a few generations. I mean, think back just a couple hundred years in American history. You might be able to name the first president of the United States, but could you name the 10th president without having to look it up? Could you tell me who the 6th Roman emperor was? Could you tell me the name of your great great grandfather? Probably not. Both the people who are most famous and the people who are closest to us really only survive in our memory for a couple of generations. Our legacy in this world truly does not last for long. Verse 12, I, the Qoheleth, was king over Israel in Jerusalem. We talked a little bit last week about some of the debate around this and what that means for authorship. Interestingly enough, he does say, I was king over Israel in Jerusalem. So some commentaries have noted that the past tense there is making it sound as if this is someone who abdicated his throne. And in fact, there were later Jewish traditions that have Solomon stepping down as king for various reasons. Some really interesting traditions. I'll include Nycott's quote on that in our notes. In the Ecclesiastes interpretation commentary, William Brown notes, as soon as the sage dons the Solomonic mantle, from chapter 1 verse 12 through chapter 2 verse 12, he disposes it in order to convey his harsh judgments against the futility of gainful living. Here, too, early Jewish tradition, as reflected in the Targum, noted this significant shift by claiming that Solomon was driven from his throne and destined by God to roam the world, weeping and lamenting. In any case, Qoheleth is a composite character who embodies the yearnings of an ambitious king and the harsh judgments of a critical sage. Perspectives also found among the contrasting figures of Gilgamesh, Sidori, and Utnapishtim in the Babylonian epic. And they give a quote from Epic of Gilgamesh. It says, you have toiled without cease, and what have you gotten? Utnapishtim asks the weary king Gilgamesh. It is the same question that Qoheleth asks himself. End of quote. So again, we see some similarities between this book and other ancient literature from the Near East. Peterson in the Message, I got a good laugh out of the way he wrote this verse. He says, call me the quester. I have been king over Israel and Jerusalem. I looked most carefully into everything, searching out all that is done in this earth. And let me tell you, there's not much to write home about. God hasn't made it easy for us. I've seen it all, and it's nothing but smoke. Smoke, spitting into the wind. Life is like a corkscrew that can't be straightened, a minus that won't add up. Now, I really like how he translated verse 15 there. Life is like a corkscrew that can't be straightened and a minus that won't add up, because it's pretty hard to translate over into English. Verse 15 says, that which is crooked cannot be made straight, and that which is wanting cannot be numbered. But before we get into that, we have to look at verse 13. I jumped ahead a little bit there. In verse 13, he says, I gave my heart to seek and search out by wisdom all things that were done under heaven. And this sore travail God has given to the sons of humanity to be exercised therewith. This is kind of a phrase that he'll use throughout the book. I gave my heart, or I set my mind. Both are legitimate translations. And the idea is essentially that he is almost like having a conversation with himself. The Net Bible compares it to the English phrase, I applied my mind to do this. They also point out that you have this hendiatus, to seek and to search out. It's when you have two very similar terms used side by side, and it's not something where we're supposed to try to find the difference between them. Like some commentaries will say, oh, to seek out means this and to search out means that, and they try to parse a distinction that isn't necessarily there. Qoheleth really likes to use hendiatus, having two similar terms side by side, in order to emphasize their similarities and to try to make a point as if this is the greatest, most comprehensive search that any person could possibly make. Now, the King James and a couple other older translations make a interpretive choice that is not the greatest when they say sore travail. Literally, this reads in English as an evil business, but translators didn't want the Bible to say that God gave humanity an evil business to be anxious about. So they softened it by saying this is sore travail. Well, that's not exactly what it means. And how you interpret the book will determine exactly how you translate this phrase. But there's quite a variety. The Net Bible notes say rotten business or grievous task. King James says sore travail. Young's Literal says sad travail. The Douay Rheims says painful occupation. NEB has sorry business, sorry task in Moffat, thankless task, grievous task, trying task, unhappy business, heavy burden in the NIV. So there's quite a variety of translation options here. But really, it gets down to saying that this is bad. This is not a good situation that we're caught up in. And the finger gets pointed at God. Nycott says the task is evil because no solution is found after all this hard work. The search leads to frustration rather than resolution. And that word at the end of the verse, that God has given this to humans to be exercised therewith, as the King James said, it's actually a word that means to be bowed low by or to be humbled by. It can also be a violent word, like someone being violent towards someone else. So again, Qoheleth is kind of interrogating God here. And I think that's important for us to realize, because a lot of Christians have this toxic positivity mindset that says we always have to be looking on the bright side of life.
Always look on the bright side of life.
And that's just not what the Bible presents as reality. That's not how life works. We aren't always happy all the time. We are not in right, outright, upright, downright happy all the time. That is a lie that we teach children in Sunday school. Sometimes life sucks, and the Bible recognizes that. Large sections of the Bible are given over to lament literature. We have entire books like Ecclesiastes and Job that put God on the witness stand and interrogate him. We do a great disservice to the Bible and our faith when we gloss over and whitewash those portions of Scripture in favor of the ones that make us feel better. We need passages like this to remind us that it is okay to hurt, and it is okay to rage against God, even as people who believe in him. If your God is really as big, strong, and mighty as you say he is, he can handle your outbursts. He can handle your questions. He can handle your doubts. He can handle your anger. It is appropriate to feel and express anger in a broken world, and even to address that toward God and ask why things aren't happening the way that we think they should happen. Now, I realize that God is God, we are not. His ways are higher than ours, all of that a lot of Christians like to quote. But that does not mean that we should turn off our brains when the world goes in a way that doesn't make logical sense within our belief system. We should be able to question the morality of it all, and Qoheleth invites us to do that along with him. I like how the New Century Version translated these few verses. It says, I decided to use my wisdom to learn about everything that happens on earth. I learned that God has given us terrible things to face. I looked at everything done on earth and saw that it's all useless, like chasing the wind. If something is crooked, you can't make it straight. If something is missing, you can't say it's there. You know, this kind of reminded me of how the world has gotten so much smaller just in a generation, 50 years. 50 years ago, if you moved away from family to a different part of the country or the world, you had to write them a letter or maybe give them a phone call. Now, you can text them. You can email them. You can FaceTime them. We have all this technology that makes the world smaller. We have faced down these problems that thousands of years humanity has been unable to overcome. And yet the more that we do this, the more we are faced with the reality that our little bubble is not the way the whole world works. As we have opened ourselves to new information and we no longer just get whatever our little tribe says, we can now read something that somebody on the complete opposite side of the world wrote. And as we get this new influx of information, we're realizing that there are other ways of looking at life, looking at God, And in some ways, ignorance is bliss. It was easier when the only position that we knew was our little circle. More information does not necessarily make you happier. It might make you more informed, it might make you more knowledgeable, it might get you closer to the truth, but just because you're closer to the truth doesn't make you happier. In fact, the better you get at understanding life, the harder it can be to enjoy. And that's the paradox that Qoheleth is bringing. That is something that so many people on deconstruction journeys say, that the further along they go on this, and the closer they get to God, the closer they get to what they believe the Bible actually says and what faith is actually supposed to be, the more they have had to wrestle with deep, dark emotions that they never considered in their happier life of simplistic beliefs. The journey toward truth and reality is not always a pleasant one. And we have to decide, are we willing to be faced with the difficult truths that what we have thought about life might not actually be true? Are we willing to sacrifice our comfort in order to move closer to the way the world actually works? Or are we going to shun that in order to stay comfortable with the things that make us feel like we know more than we actually do? Now, if you're listening to this podcast, I'm guessing you are the type of person who is willing to make that sacrifice in order to get a better understanding of God, the Bible, and the world. But it is still a difficult task. In verse 14, Qoheleth calls it Raut Uruak. If you have listened to our previous Genesis 1 through 6 series, you might recognize that second word, Ruach. It's often translated spirit or breath in our English translations of the Hebrew Bible. This phrase of Raut Uruak is kind of difficult to translate into English, and you get two main different ideas. You'll have some people who will say chasing after wind, and then you'll have others that will say vexing of spirit or something along those lines. And honestly, either one works, and it kind of changes the meaning depending on which way you take. Chasing after wind is going to be a more abstract metaphor, but it's a very poignant one. You can imagine a breezy day and maybe children out in a field somewhere, like trying to chase after the wind. You can't catch it, you're never going to be able to grasp it. So that's a possibility. The other possibility is that saying vexation of spirit. In other words, it is going to make you anxious within your very being. And I think either one fits with Qoheleth's view of the world. He could either be saying that everything is just hard to grasp. It's like chasing after wind, you're never actually going to obtain everything you want to in life. Or he could be saying that trying to do all of that will just give you headaches and ulcers. It will be a vexation of your spirit. Whenever this comes up, and it only does a couple times, I think chapter 2:11, verse 17 of that chapter, verse 26, chapter 4, verse 4, and verse 6, and then chapter 6, verse 9. I will try to bring this up again as saying, hey, this can be chasing wind, this can be vexation of spirit, and I'll let you do kind of your choose your own adventure story here, and you can take whichever path on that you prefer, because I just don't know that I can pick one over the other. I see value in both of those translations. Rabbi Shapiro brought in some more wisdom from Buddhist texts, and he says that Ryut Ruach strikes me as Hebrew parallels to the Buddha's notion of dukkha, dissatisfaction or disease. Dukkha is one of the three marks of existence, along with anicca, impermanence, and anatta, no separate self. Now, I am sorry, I do not speak or read Sanskrit, so if my pronunciations are a little off, please forgive me. I'm doing the best with what I could find online. He continues, when we live in ignorance of the impermanence of all things, including oneself, we live life in a way that produces suffering and dissatisfaction, a vexation of mind, breath, and spirit. The Buddha speaks of three kinds of dukkha. The first, dukkha, is the suffering that arises from pain, illness, old age, death, and grieving over the dead. The second kind is viparinama, the suffering caused by our insistence that life meet our expectations, despite the fact that all expectations violate the truth that life is unconcerned with our desires. The third form is sankara, psychological dissatisfaction arising from our inclination to cling to things, people, and ideas. When you live in ignorance of impermanence, what the Buddha calls anatta, and what Qoheleth calls hevel, you live in a manner that can't help but produce dis-ease, anxiety, and a troubling of your breath and spirit. The solution is not to escape from the fact of impermanence, but to learn to live wisely within it. End quote. Verse 15 talks about something being crooked. That doesn't have to have a moral connotation. It can, but it does not seem to here in this passage. It's just talking about something that has been bent and can't be straightened again. That word straightened is pretty rare in the Bible. It only shows up here in Ecclesiastes in a few verses. It is more common in later Hebrew. So this is an example of when some people will look at this and say, well, maybe Ecclesiastes was a later book, since this word that shows up only in Ecclesiastes shows up more often in later Hebrew writings. It's possible. You'll get some difference in translation at the end of verse 15 here, because it's really hard to bring over into English. But the idea seems to be that if something is lacking in life, if something is not there, you can't count it. Like, you can't count money that you don't have, is basically what he is trying to say here. It's basically intended to be a no-duh kind of moment. Uncut observes that it's obvious that if something is missing, well, it can't be counted. So the essentially flawed nature of the world is something self-evident that cannot be disputed. End of quote. In verse 16, Qoheleth says he communed with his own heart, and this would just be kind of like an internal monologue that he has going on with himself. And if we're honest, we all have that same thing going on sometimes. When he says that he was wiser than anyone who had come before him in Jerusalem, that's not so much pride. I mean, it kind of cracks me up because it does read as very prideful, but it could also just be the author trying to use this Solomonic persona to say, if Solomon couldn't be happy with everything he had, no one can. Last week I mentioned it being like if I told a story from Jeff Bezos' perspective about having everything that you could possibly want and still wanting more. Kind of that same thing. Now, when he says everyone that came before him in Jerusalem, that doesn't necessarily have to mean kings. This gets into last week's discussion about David being the only king in Jerusalem before Solomon. It could just be people in general that lived in Jerusalem, but again, the author is likely not Solomon himself and just taking on a Solomonic persona. Now, let's get philosophical here for a minute, and I want to quote from Joel Steele's Philosophy of Qoheleth again. He quotes another author, Tillich, and he says Tillich used the ancients' philosophy to emphasize the important role of the individual. In order to come to terms with life's vanity, each individual must engage in the process, become a participant rather than exist as a detached spectator. It is reason and courage, defined by the ancients, that enables the traditional existentialist to find meaning in their life. For example, reason brings the philosophy to its logical conclusion. True courage is a derivation of this reason existing only in humans, expressed by Aristotle, that enables the individual to participate. The emphasis on courage should not be taken lightly, because without courage, reasoning cannot satisfy the human condition. Thus, an existentialist is not literally choosing their essence. For example, if a soldier is removed from their occupation and assigned to a job in the civilian sector, the soldier's essence has not changed. Their identity does not hinge on their occupation. Or at least it shouldn't. The person's occupation, soldier in this case, may give meaning to their life, but the essence of who they are still exists even when their occupation changes, although the individual must now find a new meaning in their life. End of quote. We'll get more into this next week when we talk about it in chapter 2, but at this point, Qoheleth is starting to chip away at what you think makes you you. What do you see as your own identity? And what happens if that is taken away? So many people put their identity in their job or their relationships to other people. But as he has already brought up, all of that is impermanent. You could lose your job. You could lose your possessions. You could lose your family. So what happens then? Who are you when you are the only person in the room? It's a really soul-searching question that everyone has to face if they are going to truly find happiness and contentment in life. Because the more that you put your essence in what you are to other people, the less that you can appreciate who you are yourself outside of those things. We have to find some sense of meaning and significance just within ourselves, or else we can lose our own meaning when other things in life change. This is a little bit of a longer quote from Shapiro, but I think it's really good for context here. He says, "In Ecclesiastes, you spend no time longing for escape from impermanence, but rather you learn to live well in the midst of it. The bulk of the book of Ecclesiastes is an examination of life without escape. It offers no alternative to impermanence, and hence it is profoundly non-religious. Religion is all about escape, but what you really want to escape from is inescapable. It is yourself. As long as there is an I seeking salvation, redemption, enlightenment, heaven, nirvana, surrender, there is no salvation, redemption, enlightenment, heaven, nirvana, or surrender. The more you struggle, the stronger the I becomes, and the tighter the noose of despair grips your every living moment. You can't understand the book of Ecclesiastes merely by reading it, or even by studying it closely. Studying the text is not a waste of time, but just another way to pass time. It's just one more thing to do when you know that doing it will get you nowhere. You only understand Ecclesiastes when you live the truth its author perceives, the truth of endless emptying, havel havalim, no escape, the truth that there is nowhere to go and nothing to get, only this moment to live. With this, Ecclesiastes is a spiritual text that belongs to no religion. It never mentions Yahweh, the God of the Jews. It is unconcerned with tribal custom or priestly ceremony. It never speaks of the Hebrew Bible or of the commandments and customs observant Jews used to inform their lives with tradition and holiness. It simply looks at what is, and it responds. It is in this way that Ecclesiastes is a spiritual book, and its author is a spiritual sage. He recognizes the compulsion to transcend the I and escapes the reality of impermanence, and he points out the impossibility of doing so. Then, when all hope has been ripped away from you, he offers a living response to the reality of impermanence that makes surrender and escape unnecessary. End of quote. Next week, we're going to talk about what exactly that living response is that he introduces us to in chapter 2. Let's finish out the chapter with verses 17 and 18. "I gave my heart to know wisdom, to know madness and folly. I perceived that this is vexation of spirit." And again, this could be the chasing after wind or the anxiety of spirit. "For in much wisdom is much," now some translations will say grief. It's actually a word for anger. "In much wisdom there is much anger, and whoever increases knowledge increases sorrow." And that word sorrow has the idea of anxiety. Now, in verse 17, where he says that I gave my heart over, he set his heart to know wisdom, and it also says madness and folly. It's really like rashness and foolishness, you could say. Terms that are used only 4 times, and all here in Ecclesiastes. Now, this is another situation where you have some translators who get uncomfortable with Ecclesiastes, and they don't like the thought of a wise person chasing after rash and foolish things. So going all the way back to the days of the Septuagint, there have been translations that said that he chased after wisdom a second time. This seems to be a translation error where the translators thought there was a different root word that meant to be wise that was actually very similar to the word for folly. And I can put some more in the notes about that. It gets really nerdy, and I don't want to bog it down at this point. But it even happened in the Septuagint, where the word for madness or rashness, they translate it as parables. It says, "Through wisdom I tried to learn parables." But again, that would be a translation error. These are actually the words talking about rashness and foolishness. And the idea is basically that if being intelligent and sober didn't bring meaning to life, maybe being stupid and drunk would. In fact, Christopher Wright even pointed out that this could possibly be a little bit of a dig at some of the Proverbs talking about drunkenness not being wisdom. And here you have Qoheleth saying, well, I just went ahead and did everything. Oh, and I was still wise in the whole process. So it's like he's questioning the very fundamental core of the Proverbs wisdom statements. And we'll get more into this in the upcoming weeks, but he's basically trying to say you can have wisdom or you can be a stupid fool. You can try everything, you can try nothing, and you're going to die the same. So which is better? Living life and making some mistakes, or hiding from living in order to try to avoid making mistakes. Either way, you're going to die, so you might as well live a little. And even though you make mistakes, it will be okay. Now, that's not exactly the message that a lot of Christians will give you, but that is the message that Ecclesiastes is giving. And I think there's a lot of wisdom in that, actually. Rabbi Shapiro said, "Reality is reality. There is nothing you can do to change it, and all of your efforts to do so will only vex you further." In verse 18, it said that wisdom brings anger. The Dictionary of Biblical Languages defines this Hebrew word ka'as as a feeling of anxiety and sadness in a distressing situation. So Shapiro again says, Qoheleth isn't saying that wrong thinking upsets your tranquility. He's saying that all thinking does. The more you perceive the true nature of things, their impermanence, the more troubled you will become. Why? Because you desire security, and security demands permanence. If there is none of the latter, there can be none of the former. So tranquility is lost. But, as you will see, tranquility isn't Qoheleth's measure of wisdom. Joy is. End of quote. Now, later on in Ecclesiastes Annotated and Explained, Shapiro compares these wisdom statements in Ecclesiastes to Zen koans. And he says these koans are baffling puzzles that Zen masters put to their students. The purpose of a koan is to burn through the notion that you can reason your way to wisdom and awakening. The aim of all koans is to fry your rational mind, to exhaust your capacity to create verbal hideouts behind which to escape the inevitability of death, and in this way to realize the reality of your own impermanence. This is the koan that is the book of Ecclesiastes. How do I live well in the face of impermanence? A state of continual emptying, unknowing, and uncertainty. You can't answer this as an observer. You can only glimpse the answer in the midst of your life. This moment, or perhaps this one. Or, to borrow from Zen Master Hillel, if not now, when? Ecclesiastes is not about the afterlife or how to escape the inevitability of death. It is about reality, wild, raw, and impermanent. Seeing things as they are, yet wanting them to be other than they are, troubles your breath and robs you of tranquility. The key is to accept things as they are, in a state of constant emptying. In this way, you will not chase after the illusion of permanence or immortality, but find joy in the fleeting nature of life. End quote. I really appreciate Shapiro's insights here because, if I'm being honest with you, I really resonate with the type of person he's talking about in that last paragraph. The type of person who sees life as it is but wants it to be something other than that. And he's right, it just leads to anxiety. I mentioned last week that for a decade now, I have struggled with depression. And I think a lot of it for me kind of stems from this constant desire for more. If we go back to the illustration from the very beginning about trying to find the best movie or the best restaurant ever or what have you, like that is me. I am that person. I can eat the best burger that there possibly is in the state of New Jersey, and yet the very next week I will be trying to find a new restaurant to see if there's a better burger that I've never had yet. And I sometimes struggle to enjoy the things that I actually already have and like because I'm constantly trying to find something new. I struggle to even rewatch my favorite movies because there are so many ones out there that are good that I've never seen. And it can just get me caught in this loop of endlessly trying to find something new, something better, and I then miss out on all the good that I have right in front of me. I'm kind of an extreme example of that, but I think so many of us at our core are constantly searching for something that we think we don't have, and we think that the next step will get us there. If I can just get that new job, if I could just get that promotion, if I could just get that boyfriend or girlfriend, or if I could just get a new spouse, or if I could get a new car, or if my kids could just get to this age, or if I, fill in the blank. We always have that one next step, and that's when we'll be okay. But when that happens, we find that we're not much happier. And there's some new thing that we're just trying to get to. Qoheleth calls that hevel. And ruot ruach is an anxiety of spirit, a chasing after wind. It's smoke that we are going after. I realize this has probably been a very mentally exhausting conversation to have. And Ecclesiastes will do that to you. It is a deep book. And he comes right to bat swinging for the fences on the very first pitch, right? He is really trying to deconstruct the things that we grasp onto in this life in this first chapter. It's the shock factor of starting your speech like this. Now, next week, we're going to continue this interrogation of all the things that we turn to in life for purpose. But he's going to end chapter 2 with his conclusion. We get the first hint of what his answer to all this is. If all these things don't actually make us as happy as we think they do or hope they will, what is the answer? What should we actually do? And we get that right at the end of chapter 2. And it's a really thought-provoking challenge. It's very different than what you're going to hear in most churches. It is not the religious message that you would expect. It is not just trust God and read your Bible every day and everything will turn out. It's actually much more grounded, much more realistic. And because of that, it actually becomes one of my favorite verses in the entire Bible. So whatever you're feeling about the book so far, whether you agree with Qoheleth or disagree, whether you like talking about this or you're feeling a little anxious about it, just hold off your judgment until next week and we get to his conclusions, and I think that'll give us a fuller perspective of what's going on in the book. For right now, I realize again this has been some deep material, so as soon as we finish here in just a second, take a breath, put your headphones aside, stretch, get some water, go for a short walk outside or something. Just kind of recenter yourself and your focus, because this can be very heady and you might just need a little bit of a break after it. But I appreciate your being on this journey with me. I am really loving what we have gotten out of this so far, and I would love to hear from you what you're thinking about this. So feel free to email us, comment on the socials, or reach out on the website so we can hear what you're thinking about this Ecclesiastes study. And until next week, stay curious and keep asking questions about the Uncut and Unfiltered Bible. You've been listening to the Bible Uncut and Unfiltered. We hope we provided a healing place to discuss the questions you can't ask and the context you won't learn in church. If you enjoyed the podcast, would you take a minute to share it with a friend? You could also rate and review on your podcast app. If you'd like to donate to keep our work going, you can go to our website, thebibleuncut.com, and click on the Support Us tab. While you're there, check out the recommended resources and blog where we post show notes and other articles. Thanks for listening. We'll see you next week.